from Utile, from Utile. Matthew, did you want to share your presentation, or?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Great. Steve, does he have that permission already?
Yes, he should.
Great.
It will stop yours from sharing. Is that okay?
Let me just. Here we go.
Okay, thank you.
And for those in the room, there may be some paper copies of this floating around. I'm not sure. Yeah. And for those not in the room, these will of course be posted shortly to the MBTA Communities Working Group website.
It's loading. Can you see my screen?
We can.
Yes.
Or I can.
Terrific.
Yes.
Okay, what we were tasked with doing was, in the wake of the last public meeting, was to explore some alternative scenarios that maintained some of the basic planning principles that were embedded in the last map, but to see where and how we might tighten it up, put it on a little bit of a diet, as they say, and maybe make it a little bit more focused. So we've created these scenarios for you guys to review as a sort of next version alternative to the scenario that we developed for the last public meeting. And I'll get into it in a second, but we're gonna quickly review the base scenario. We're calling this the base scenarios now, the 725 public meeting. And then we have 3 alternatives. They all have the same basic boundary, but there are variables such as the heights in the neighborhood district, and we explored one that was sort of tiered in the neighborhood district that sort of transitions from 4 stories to 3 stories. Okay, the base scenario for review looks like this. I think we're all pretty familiar with it. It was based loosely on a sort of 350-foot catchment area off of Broadway and Mass Ave. That sort of grew in certain places, so in fact, in many cases, it was slightly bigger. This is a zoom in on the East Arlington portion, and then a zoom in on the central area. And to review, there were some complications with the model. While we had fairly significant setbacks that would have really limited some of this development, the model doesn't really respond very well to setbacks. And so we've assembled some what we call proxy inputs to simulate how those setbacks might restrict development. The state will probably be accepting these proxies. The model sort of puts proxies in for you, and when they do their final review, they will be sort of double checking this sort of anomaly in the model. But I wanted to share where the numbers landed based on different sort of inputs that we put into it. So for that last version, if we put in a minimum open space variable, and that would be set at 40% for the Mass Ave Broadway districts, and then 60% for the neighborhood sub-districts. Open space, just to be clear, is not green space or usable open space. The open space that the model, as the model understands it, is simply any space in which there is not a building. So we think, I'll talk about this a little bit more, but we think it's actually a pretty good proxy. And anyway, so when I plugged in those numbers, And by the way, these percentage numbers are based on a sampling of regular parcel sizes, doing tests to see how much each parcel was diminished by the setbacks. Because the parcels in the neighborhood district are smaller, the setbacks left about 40% developable area, and the larger parcels generally in the Mass Ave Broadway district resulted in about 40%. Anyway, we plug in all these numbers and we end up with about 11,000 unit capacity. If we use maximum lot coverage, this is a different metric. Maximum lot coverage includes any buildings and any impervious area, like parking, for instance. For some reason, we get a fairly similar number, but for some reason we get a slightly higher number. Again, it's a quirk of the model, but we're just, again, trying to approximate the impacts of those setbacks. And just so you have a feel for it, without either of those limiting factors, and with a model that doesn't quite understand setbacks, the numbers jump to about 20,000. And we've gone into the data, we've looked at particular parcels, and we know that that is actually not possible. It's a little bit of a flaw in the model. The model, when you don't put any open space and you do have setbacks, the model gives you 20% as a kind of guesstimate, but that's really not sufficient given the setbacks. So I wanted to sort of clarify that. That was one of those things that we've been working through on the technical side, the state, to really understand how the model is working and how they're going to treat it. But I wanted to share those sort of relative numbers with you. And this is a summary so that when you guys have this show of what those variables really are. And again, we think that open space is the most accurate and the best way for us to account for those setbacks. Okay, so a few alternatives. Alternatives A1 and A2 are testing 4 stories versus 3 stories in the neighborhood district. And more substantially, we reduced the offset from the avenues to 250 feet instead of 350 plus. You'll also see, as I zoom in, that we were a little bit more rigorous, let's say, about that distance, so that we applied it a little bit more objectively, not sort of taking the liberty to grab an extra block or, just go to the nearest street. But we wanted to do something that felt a little bit more objective, something that we could sort of put a little bit more measurement to. And so in the eastern portion, you'll see it cuts off generally around 3 or 4 parcels. You'll see that it doesn't really sprawl quite as much, but it is certainly legible in its intent, which is to create a multifamily district along Mass Ave that allows for some density, and then a kind of transitional zone that's in the pink that goes back to the approximate depth of some of the larger parcels that do abut Mass Ave. And then in the central, it plays out in a slightly different way because it's a little bit more disrupted by the commercial zoning, but we try to apply as much as possible with some rigor, again, that sort of 250-foot rule. So in this alternative A1, we kept, in the blue Mass Ave Broadway districts, we kept the height limit at 4 feet. We also increased, this is another request that we received to see what the impact would be, we increased the front setbacks to 15 feet universally. And in this scenario, we were also maintaining that 4-story height limit in the neighborhood district. far as I understand, the height bonus in the Mass Ave Broadway district is still on the table, but for modeling purposes, we don't include that in the model. So for the purposes of the model, we sort of default to a kind of minimum as of right of 4 stories. We've put in similar open space limitations. Again, these are there just to pretty closely approximate the impacts of those setbacks. And we end up with a number that's about 7,500 units. So, a few thousand or more less than the previous map for obvious reasons. The map has gotten smaller. If we go down to 3 stories universally in the neighborhood multifamily district, that number drops by about 1,000 to 6,500 units. So those are the two sort of number outputs that relate to those first two versions. And I just, you'll notice also Claire asked us to break this up not only according to the districts, but to the clustering of those districts. So if we were to do just East Arlington, for instance, both the blue and the pink areas, what you see is a district that would minimally comply. And that was a question that came up a lot. So I think it's good to understand what a minimally compliant district looks like. We didn't draw it specifically, but it relates to the map that we already have, and it's data that we were able to get. So if we were just in the center and the heights, we sort of just squeak by our 2046 requirement, and we're I think comfortably over on acreage and density. We were also asked to do a tiered scenario, so some way of transitioning from 4 stories down to 3, and ultimately, obviously, to 2.5 of the neighboring context. There are there are many ways to do this. There are many ways to craft zoning for transitional. One way is to simply draw a map of where the cutoff is, and that's what we've done here, just so that we have some certainty around it. You'll see, for instance, that we've simply taken it back at least a parcel, or close to the depth of another parcel, and we could fiddle with this a little bit, but we wanted to understand more or less, the intent was that the portions that are 4 stories are sort of equal in depth to the portions that are 3 stories. This approach does not mean that every blue parcel here could get a density bonus and go up to 60 feet. I think that when you would finally craft the zoning, you would make a distinction between the parcels that are abutting the avenues and those that are not. The parcels abutting the avenue being eligible for the bonus, the height bonus, but the ones set back off of behind not being eligible, but just simply going to 4 stories. And again, there are many ways to model this. This is one way where you just simply draw a map and you pick your lines. There are other ways where you might indicate, for portions that are X number of feet away from the center line of Mass Ave, this is the height. Further than this amount of feet, you go down to 3 stories. That's an equally valid, approach. For modeling purposes, in terms of compliance, this is the most direct way to have a sort of more immediate discussion with this group. And this is what that looks like on Mass Ave. And the punchline punchline is not surprising. We get a total unit capacity between the 3-story and the 4-story version. The one thing that would need some refinement here is that we did not create a sort of separate subsection where those blue parcels off of the avenue would have a 10-foot side yard. For the purposes of capacity, it's not really affecting the model, and it's not really affecting the numbers, but that's something that you'd want to track if a tiered approach was what you were looking for, so that you have the set that you might have sort of 3 districts in a way, one on the avenue, one just behind with different setbacks and so forth.
Matthew, sorry to interrupt. Could we also, as a possibility, treat that in sort of the same way as we treat the bonuses? But we'll keep the districts as you propose them here, and we say that 10 foot is the side setback, except if you're touching Mass Ave. Is that a possibility? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. It's very easy. I just wanted to.
Yeah. I understand. Got it.
Yeah, it's easy to implement in the zoning. It is. So this is a summary, again, based on consistently using that open space percentage, again, just as a proxy. I will say that my recommendation is to only use that limitation as a modeling proxy for compliance. Any of these scenarios would be very compliant. I don't think would be a problem, but I think what I've gleaned from the working group is that you prefer for the development to be limited volumetrically, that is by setbacks and by height, and not by other variables like open space or lot coverage or things of that nature. But that's a decision that you can all make. So we go from about 11,000. The 4-story alternative A1, again, 7,500. 3-story, we go down to 6,500, and again, the tiered version comes in somewhere sort of in between. All of these are very comfortably compliant, both in terms of acreage and capacity and density. So I will leave it there to see if there's any questions. I think.
I have. Well,
Yeah,
sorry.
go ahead.
Finish your thought, and then I have one thing I wanted you to clarify for us.
I'll let you go ahead, Sanjay.
Sure. One thing I think it would be great for both the working group to remind us and the folks who are watching as well is, can you remind us what capacity means again, and what maybe some of the things that it doesn't mean?
Yes. So capacity is the. Let me go back to a map because it's good to have a visual. Capacity is an estimate of the maximum number of units that would be possible if every single parcel that's indicated in a color on this map were vacated, right? So it's not the net new, and that's a calculation that we can do. We just haven't quite gotten to it yet. But it's not the net new number of units. It's the amount of units that theoretically could be supported by all of the parcels in this district if the tornado came, wiped them all clean, and everyone was building as of right to the zoning.
Would it also be accurate to say that capacity is not taking into account the likelihood of any particular parcel to be redeveloped?
No, it is indiscriminate. So there are parcels in here that have very stable. Some of them, have very stable, well entrenched multifamily uses already in place. Unlikely that they would be moved. I think you'll also find that where there's home ownership on smaller parcels, some of the 2.5-story fabric. Those, in my experience, tend to be less prone to redevelopment.
Great. Thanks.
Steve and Shayna have questions.
Okay, and I see Vince does as well. I don't know the exact order that I don't know the exact order that the hands went up here, so I'll pick randomly and I'll go with Vince.
Thanks, and thank you for the presentation. That's really informative, and I can tell that there's been a lot of work that's gone into it, both in terms of the map, but also in terms of trying to understand the dimensional constraints and the model. I would say that as a working group, we've been pretty clear that we're not chasing capacity any more than in school we chase gold stars or straight A's. I think we're looking for something that's in line with our values as a town. And I'm curious so we understand that the model capacity is a sort of a theoretical concept. I'm just curious if it is possible and if you've made any attempt to model or project how many units might be constructed, or if that's something that's kind of out of our ability to know.
I think it's out of our ability to know unless you did a very involved financial economic development analysis.
Okay, right. It'll depend on the market. It'll depend on,
It depends on the market, the value
jobs.
of things, propensity for change. There are economic experts that make those kinds of estimates, but it's probably beyond our abilities right now.
Okay, thank you very much.
And then I'll just go around since I don't know what order. I think Meta was the first one who had her hands.
I'll go last because mine's more of a comment than a question.
Okay, sure. Then who does next? Shayna's, if I'm seeing correct in that little.
Yeah, just clarifying question. It looked like the lot cover, the minimum open space proxy did not change when the setbacks changed. Is that because there really will be no substantive impact, or was why was that?
That's a very good question. It didn't change that much, and in fact, the 40 and the 60 are actually more emblematic or more representative of our new setbacks than our old ones. We applied these to the old ones just sort of retroactively to see what the number was, but these numbers are based on an analysis of these particular setbacks, 15 feet and 5 feet. So just so you know a little bit how the math works, a lot of the very typical neighborhoody parcels, right, that you kind of see everywhere, these are almost universally around 5,000 square feet, approximately 50 by 100 deep. When you plug in all the setbacks, you're left with 40% developable area, and that's how we came up with these numbers. And we did a similar, a little bit more complicated analysis of the multifamily district. So that's where these numbers come from.
Thank you, Matthew. We haven't had a number of people join since the beginning of the meeting, so I'll read you my little spiel from the beginning that this is a working session of the MBTA Communities Working Group, and so we won't be taking public comment or questions this evening. We will have upcoming office hours, and we also have an email address that you can find on the committee's webpage where comments and questions are definitely welcome. And so with that, I'll return to going around and
Steve.
Oh, Steve.
Yes, thank you, Sanjay. I was wondering, just a clarifying question for Mr. Utile. The model assumes that all dwelling units are 1,000 square feet. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
Great. I'm not sure, again, did Laura have a question from before? No, okay. All right, then let's go to Meta then.
Okay, I don't have a question. I
Sure.
have a comment, just to kick the discussion off a little bit. Because we have to make some decisions tonight, I understand. So in all of the scenarios from the base to all the alternatives, what I see is two great concentration on East Arlington. And that's in part because we have two major corridors there, and therefore we have, we have two corridors with the higher proposed, and then this offset of 250 or 350 or whatever to either direction. And so for the streets in between Mass Ave and Broadway, they really have a very radical and drastic rezoning. And I have noticed since I was away that all of Arlington Heights along Mass Ave has dropped off the map. And I would like to spend some time discussing how we can further pare back the neighborhood multifamily subdistrict in East Arlington, and as far as well, I have a proposal about that I would like to offer. But my point is that East Arlington is overburdened in terms of school districts, in terms of parking, compared to the rest of Arlington. And there are two major corridors there, and in addition to that, it is almost entirely R2, which is one of Arlington's multifamily zones. So it's already built out to two-family, 2.5 stories, which in practicality really is 3 stories, because every building I know in my neighborhood has dormered out the entire 3rd floor. So I would like to propose that we further scale back the pink or the neighborhood multifamily in East Arlington to the extent that we remove it entirely.
Sorry, folks, I lost my mute button there for a second. Okay.
I would, if I could just make a quick comment about that.
Sure.
If we're talking about removing the pink, let me go back to this version. If we remove the pink entirely here, we don't have a contiguous district. In other words, the blue on its own cannot meet the definition of contiguity.
That's fine, Matthew. I think you can figure it out. It's a design problem.
We have faith, Matthew.
That's not a reason. That's not a good enough reason.
So I actually disagree. I think a question about how much neighborhood sub-district belongs in East Arlington is a valid is something we can discuss, but I don't think that we should be losing all of the neighborhood sub-district in East Arlington. I think there is value to a mix of types and tenures, but a mix of building types throughout the entire town. And as you say, there are a lot of two families, so the truth is that a lot of those are not going to get converted anyway.
Right, so why waste our time rezoning them? And I would also say,
why lose the opportunity?
because it's not a good opportunity, and I'll tell you why. as an architect, I'll tell you that